Hello, I'm Dennis Pervinsky, and welcome to Grandpa Dennis's Woodturning Studio. Today, I have a Birch Burl that's been sitting in my shed since 2002. It's 10 inches by 10 inches, and I'm not quite sure what I'm going to be doing with this yet. At first glance, this looks like a well-proportioned burl, nice and round, and everything should be quite simple to work with. The burl ends at this level and it ends at that level, which isn't that far off. However, when you turn it this way, the burl ends here and then it ends down here. So I'm going to have to do this to get it centered properly. I believe my first task is going to be to put the live center in the middle here. That should be easy to find since it's pretty round and geometrically correct that way. And then I'll put my drive center on this side and balance it out like so to get it so that I can cut right down and have just burl on the bottom. So it's off to the lathe, we'll do that. Then the question comes, what do I do with it after I've got it nicely centered? Well, stay tuned because I'm looking to do something quite a bit different with it. The first thing I did was find the center, and then I drilled out a hole in here so that my spur center could fit in there properly. Okay, the way it's centered now, this part and the opposite of it is here. Those are pretty close. On this side, I've got that center coming about here, and it comes about there. So the burl isn't quite geometrically correct as I thought it was. What I'm going to do is try and true this up so that it's nice and flat, the bottom. And then I can put it on the new device that I got from Stockroom Supplies, and you'll see that fairly soon. This was going to take all day, so I brought out my cordless chainsaw and made fast work of the cut. So the first thing I do is a few measurements on the pail. That's the pail I'm going to be using to make the casting. On the bottom of the pail, I've measured the angle. The bottom of the pail is smaller than the top. So that means I have to cut a circle for my wood at an angle so that the bottom fits in nicely in the top. If I made the wood the same distance as this, I couldn't get it to the bottom. If I made it the same circle as the bottom, then I've got a lot of gap all the way around here, which is wasting a lot of precious resin. Then I set the angle of my table so that it is that same angle. So that table is tilted to match the angle of the bucket. So the bottom of the bowl, I've measured that out with calipers. The bottom of the bowl comes out to 7¼ inches. So I'm going to make the bottom of the bowl 7 inches so that it fits nicely in there. The jig I'm going to use for my bandsaw is from stockroomsupply.com. It's called the Round Ripper Circle Cutter. This is the aluminum casting that the jig actually slides in and out of. And this is the jig. It fits into the grooves, like so. And it's got 2 pivot points. My first measurement is the distance between the blade and the bottom pivot point. The bottom of the casting pail is 7 inches, so I want 3.5 here. There's my 3.5, and I lock the table into place. Then I move my jig so that the pivot points are in line with the teeth of the saw blade. Then a stop at this end gets locked in place, so I can't go any further. Pull this back. Now on my burl, I have screwed in the bottom pivot point into the center. That will fit into this recess. Like so. And the center from my lathe that I had determined is down here, and I'll screw in the top pivot point. Now this piece can revolve and it's locked in place. Now when I eyeball the distance from the blade to the pivot point on the top, that's 4 inches, which doubled means 8, and that's the diameter of my casting pail. It's important to have a good bandsaw blade and the guides adjusted correctly. Slow and steady rotation is best. This process could have been done on the lathe, but the circle cutter was very slick and made an accurate tapered cut. It's also much faster. So this is my first attempt with the Round Ripper circle cutter, and it sure did a nice job of cutting that. I can't believe it. So this will be the top of my bowl. And I'm putting that in first because of all the round parts in here that I need to be filled with resin. So if I had it this way in the casting pail, I'd have to have enough resin to come up so that when it did soak in, it's covered this part. So rather than doing that, I'm reversing it. This was the original surface. I would have taken all of this bark off and spent about an hour taking it off and getting it all cleaned up. Now I don't have to do that because the only bit of bark is over here and here. I did lose quite a bit of diameter in here, as you can tell, but my casting pail wasn't big enough. And the bigger casting pail was too big. So, in order to save on resin and get the most I can out of that burl, I made it this size. So, let's see if it fits. Wow, that's pretty darn good. Now, there is a problem here. I have a larger gap between the blank and the pail than I would have liked. I undercut it to make sure that it fit properly. There's nothing worse than being 1/8 of an inch too big and then trying to cut 1/8 of an inch off on a bandsaw is really tricky. So I erred on the side of making it smaller. The next time I do this, I'll make it more right on the mark. So this will be the bottom, the underside will be the top. Well, that worked pretty good. And as you notice, I didn't have to really true up this part of the burl because the bottom here wasn't trued up. I just cut a little bit off to make sure that it wasn't catching on the table as I spun it around. So I can do an uneven bottom as long as the whole burl is raised above the bed and rotates freely on the bottom pivot point. Well, let's see what we can do with this. Next is to take off the little bit of bark. So it's time for mixing up all the epoxy. Here's my casting pail. I'm putting the blank into it. There we go. I'm going to be using designer epoxy, and I'm using the deep cast. And I'll be using silver black, and I'll be mixing in as well a little bit of mother pearl. So first thing is to use up what's left of my epoxy in here. This is part B, so I put one of these parts into two of those parts. Oh, I now have a piece of cardboard over top of the wood and then a rock on top of that. The rock is there to put the wood down into the epoxy, keep it from floating. Wherever I can, I like to put a pail, the pail that is going to be the casting pail, inside another pail. And the reason for that is when in the vacuum chamber, bubbles come up and they might overflow the white pail, the small casting pail, and they'll go into the other pail instead of into my vacuum chamber and spoil the floor of that. I just have to balance this rock to make sure that it's balancing the wood. I should have made a flat spot on the other surface, and that would have helped index it better. I think that'll do. It's not a major problem. Now this is just an acrylic lid with a vacuum system on it, and it goes right on top of my pressure pot, so I have two in one. I do not want these bubbles to overflow the white pail if possible, because I'm losing resin when that happens. So if it comes too close to the top, I'll shut the vacuum off and it'll dissipate the bubbles. This process could take an hour, maybe even two. There are less bubbles coming out now, so I just might leave the vacuum on for 45 minutes to an hour and then shut it off and put on the pressure pot. The pressure pot will stay pressurized for 3 days until the resin cures. I'm truing up the bottom of the casting to receive a waste block. In this case, I'm using hot glue because the connection between the casting and the waste block is wood to wood. I found that hot glue does not stick well to resin. Then I turn a tenon to accept the larger tower jaws of my one-way stronghold chuck. I just want to take this opportunity to thank all my viewers for supporting me and ask them to make comments on this video or hit the like button. This will really help my channel grow. You'll notice I drilled a center hole to the depth I wanted. I find this technique is fast and gives me a more accurate measurement for the bottom thickness. One of the aspects of a good turning is a consistent and thin wall thickness. It also helps to prevent cracking and warping. The sanding on this piece started at 120 grit and went all the way to 800 grit. Here's another sponsor of my channel. It's called Abernet. Abernet sandpaper. It's actually a screen, and I've got it in the higher grits, 400, 600, 800, and 1000. Now the good thing about this is when you're sanding resin, the resin clogs up typical sandpaper. So here's a typical 360 grit paper. I just do one pass on here and it's all clogged up. The resin does that. However, with Abernet, clogs up, you just blow it out. Because it's a mesh, you can blow it out and the particles just blow out and your sandpaper is good to go. Now it's time to reverse turn this so that I can get the foot shaped properly. My tailstock weighs almost 50 pounds, so rather than manually lift it on and off the bed, I hook it to an electric hoist that puts it out of the way near the top of the ceiling. This is an adapter from one way for my live center, and on this side is the threads that fit the chuck. One of the big problems in reverse turning is to center the piece so that you've got it more accurately centered so you can turn the bottom properly. There's a number of ways to do that. Mine is probably one of the simpler ways if you have a vacuum chuck, which I think a lot of wood turners are now finding that's extremely useful. So the vacuum chuck will hold the piece on there, but how do you get it centered? That's the trick. That's where the attachment comes in handy. Now that piece is centered, the same centers, the same plane as it was when I turned it. All I have to do now is take the chuck off and turn the bottom down. I'm going to put my tailstock up here so that I can continue to put pressure on it. Now that's going to operate like a jam chuck, but with some vacuum in there for added support. When I turn down this part, the waist block, then I'll have a better sense of the bottom, of turning the bottom of the piece. The last nub on the bottom of the piece was sanded off at my workbench. My finish is a homemade recipe of boiled linseed oil, pure tung oil, and varathane. Please check out my previous video on the perfect homemade finish. Now it's time for the secret sauce finish. This is a very dry burl, so I think it's going to soak up a lot. I'm gonna let that soak in for a few minutes, come back and do some more before I do the final wipe off. Here's the finished piece. The burl grain in here is quite spectacular. It's got a lot of sheen into it and just a slight bit of resin around the rim. There's a couple of issues that I have with this piece. Number one, I started off with a 10-inch by 10-inch diameter burl, and I end up with 6½ inches by 4½ inches. Not what I typically do. The other thing is, I cast this in a bucket of resin. However, because of the design that I did, almost all of that resin is turned away, and I just have a little bit on the lip, which is fine, but I could have put this into the pail and only put this much resin in to get the same result. So those are things that I'll learn for the next time. However, I really like the design of this. This is called a Krater design that was developed, first of all, I believe, by the ancient Greeks. The Romans took it as well and did some modification to it. But it's this typical shape that's called the Krater, and the Greeks have used that. It's got the lip to it, the bowl, the stem, and the foot. I think the proportions are just right, and I think this is a great piece. So, if you like this video, please subscribe, hit the like button, leave a comment for me. The best way for me to grow my channel is for you to share this link with your friends and fellow woodturners if you're a woodturner. More viewers of my channel on YouTube are important. They're going to allow me to continue to do this and continue to make videos for people. So until the next time, keep on turning.
Grandpa Dennis is turning.
I'm alright, 'cause I'm okay. Doesn't matter if my beard is gray. Just listen, I have something to say.
Grandpa Dennis is turning.
I'm alright, 'cause I'm okay. And this old goat has something to say. So just keep learning from Grandpa Dennis is turning.